Close your eyes, just for a moment, and let your mind drift back, way back, not to last week or last year, but to a time so ancient it feels almost like a dream. You're not in your cozy bed anymore. Instead, you find yourself hovering, not quite on, but just above, a vast, sun-drenched plain. Below you, the land stretches out, flat and surprisingly fertile, especially considering it's surrounded by what will one day be known as deserts. This is Mesopotamia, you realize, a name that, if you listen closely, whispers of its very essence, the land between the rivers. And oh, what rivers they are. To your left, a shimmering ribbon of blue snakes its way south, the Tigris, restless and quick. To your right, a broader, more meandering silver thread, the Euphrates, flows with a gentler rhythm. These aren't just pretty features on a map. They are the very lifeblood of this place. The reason anyone, anything, can truly thrive here. Imagine the scene. Parched earth given way to lush green as you approach their banks. A vibrant contrast that practically screams, life lives here. It's like finding an oasis in the middle of a very long, very hot road trip, isn't it? Except this oasis is thousands of miles wide. Before permanent homes, before cities, before even a single written word, this land was home to wanderers. You can almost feel the dust under your bare feet as you trudge alongside them, a small band of humans, perhaps your own ancient ancestors, moving with the seasons. They are hunter-gatherers, keenly attuned to the subtle whispers of the land. They know where the wild grains grow thickest after the spring floods, where the gazelles graze, and which thorny bushes bear edible berries. Their lives are a constant dance with nature, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the unpredictable moods of the two great rivers. You might see them, hunched over, digging for wild tubers with sharpened sticks, or patiently setting traps for waterfowl in the marshlands fed by the overflowing rivers. There's a primal satisfaction in their movements, a deep, instinctual knowledge that has been passed down through countless generations. This isn't a Netflix binge. It's a constant, active engagement with survival. And yet, there's a certain freedom too, isn't there? No rent, no mortgage, just the open sky and the immediate necessities of the day. Of course, there's also the constant threat of a saber-toothed tiger deciding you look like a tasty midnight snack. So perhaps the trade-off isn't entirely idyllic. But even in this seemingly simple existence, the seeds of something grander are being sown. These aren't just aimless wanderers. They are learning, observing, adapting. They see how the river's bounty allows for more sustenance, more reliably, than the harsh deserts or the dense forests elsewhere. They notice patterns in the floods, the way the water recedes, leaving behind a rich, dark mud, silt, we call it now, a gardener's dream. They begin to understand that this annual renewal is a gift, a promise of future harvests. Think of it like a really slow-motion light bulb moment, dawning over generations. Hey, someone probably thought, if we keep coming back to this spot where the food is always plentiful, maybe we don't have to walk quite so far next time. It's the very beginning of a revolutionary idea. Why move to the food when you can make the food move to you? This simple observation, this nascent understanding of agricultural potential is the first tiny ripple that will eventually swell into the mighty wave of civilization. Historians still argue whether the initial impulse for settlement was purely environmental bounty or if some early social structures encouraged staying put. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a delicious paradox where abundance encouraged stability, and stability, in turn, fostered greater abundance. You watch as these small groups, perhaps weary of endless wandering, start to linger a little longer in favored spots. Maybe they build a temporary shelter, a wattle and daub hut that's more than just a windbreak. They might even try to guide some of that rich river water to a patch of wild grain, not fully understanding irrigation yet, but experimenting, playing, learning. It's like a child playing in a sandbox, discovering how to make water flow where they want it to go, but on a scale that will, in time, feed millions. This land, with its twin arteries, is offering an invitation, a challenge, a promise. And these early Mesopotamians are slowly, tentatively, beginning to accept it. You can almost hear the soft splash of the river, the rustle of reeds in the wind, lulling you deeper into this ancient world. That tentative lingering, that experimental dabbling with water and earth, slowly but surely blossomed into something more substantial. You watch, as if in a time lapse, as those temporary shelters become less temporary. The wattle and daub huts, once easily abandoned, are now reinforced, built with a bit more intention. People start to gather in slightly larger groups, not just family units, but perhaps a few families together, drawn to the same fertile bends in the rivers. This is where the magic begins. The first permanent settlements are starting to dot the landscape, like tiny, determined freckles on the vast canvas of Mesopotamia. Imagine the shift in mindset. No longer are you packing up your meager belongings every few weeks, always chasing the next meal. Now, you're investing in a place. You're clearing a patch of land, not just to forage, but to cultivate. This means understanding cycles, really understanding them. When do the floods come? When does the sun beat down too fiercely? How much water does that wild barley need to truly thrive? It's like moving from being a casual diner to running your own restaurant. Suddenly, you're responsible for the entire supply chain. These early villages, like Jarmo or Tel Malafat, weren't grand cities by any stretch. Think more along the lines of a small, close-knit community you might stumble upon today, nestled away from the main roads. Perhaps a dozen or so mud brick houses clustered together for safety and companionship. You can almost smell the wood smoke curling from their hearths. Hear the soft murmur of voices, the occasional bleating of a domesticated goat. Yes, animals are starting to join the revolution too. No longer just prey, they're becoming partners in this new way of life, offering milk, meat, wool, and even a bit of companionship. The daily rhythm changes profoundly. While still reliant on hunting and gathering to supplement their diets, a significant portion of their energy is now dedicated to the fields. You're out there, under the relentless Mesopotamian sun, tilling the soil with rudimentary hoes, sowing seeds, and crucially, figuring out how to manage that tricky river water. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about control, about shaping the environment to your will. It's the first step on a very long ladder towards complex societies. This era sees the slow, painstaking development of what we call the Neolithic Revolution. Though a revolution might be a bit misleading, it wasn't a sudden, dramatic uprising. It was more like a glacial creep of ingenuity. People weren't just discovering agriculture, they were perfecting it. They were selecting the best seeds from the most robust plants, gradually transforming wild grains into domesticated crops that yielded more food with less effort. It's the original optimization project, long before anyone had heard of spreadsheets or algorithms. With more reliable food sources, something amazing happens. Population begins to grow, and with more people comes a need for more organization. You can't just have everyone doing their own thing anymore. Who decides where the new fields will be? Who ensures the water is shared fairly among everyone's crops? These are the questions that slowly begin to shape leadership roles. Maybe it's the wisest elder or the most skilled farmer, or perhaps even the person with the best knack for resolving squabbles over a misplaced hoe. Historians still argue whether these early leaders emerged organically from within the community, or if some individuals asserted dominance through strength or charisma. It's likely a bit of both, a messy, human process. You might notice something else too: specialization. Not everyone needs to be a hunter and a farmer and a toolmaker. As food becomes more abundant, some individuals have the luxury of dedicating their time to specific crafts. You might see someone patiently chipping away at a piece of obsidian to create a sharper blade, or another meticulously weaving baskets from reeds to store the surplus grain. This division of labor is a quiet but monumental shift. It means efficiency, innovation, and ultimately a richer, more complex material culture. Imagine how exciting it must have been to trade a particularly well-made flint tool for a generous portion of freshly harvested wheat. It's the very first stirrings of an economy beyond simple bartering. Even the architecture reflects this growing stability. Instead of flimsy, temporary dwellings, you see mud brick houses with multiple rooms, perhaps even courtyards. Some might even have early forms of storage pits for grain, hinting at a future where food could be saved for lean times, a buffer against the unpredictability of nature. It's like these early Mesopotamians are saying, we're not just visitors here, we're home. And that sense of belonging, of putting down roots, is incredibly powerful. It changes everything. From this relatively modest beginning, the path to something truly extraordinary stretches out before you. With those permanent settlements firmly rooted, something truly remarkable started to take shape. A distinct culture began to bloom. You're now witnessing what historians call the Ubaid period, roughly from 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. Think of it as Mesopotamia's long adolescence, where all those early experiments and adaptations started to coalesce into something recognizable, something with its own unique flavor. It's like a band finally finding its sound after years of garage practices. Things are getting good. The first thing you'd probably notice is the pottery. Everywhere. No longer just rough utilitarian vessels. Ubaid pottery is distinctive. Imagine smooth, wheel-made pots, bowls, and jars adorned with geometric patterns, often painted in dark colors on a light background. These aren't just practical items, they're artistic expressions, a testament to growing skill and a sense of aesthetics. You can almost feel the cool, smooth clay in your hands as you examine a beautifully crafted bowl. Why is pottery so important? Well, besides being great for storing all that surplus grain, remember that these durable artifacts give archaeologists incredible insights into trade networks and cultural diffusion. If you find Ubaid pottery far from its presumed origin, it means someone was moving and something was being exchanged. It's like finding a vintage band t-shirt in a thrift store miles from the concert venue. A story instantly unfolds. But it wasn't just about pretty pots. This era saw significant technological advancements. You'd observe more sophisticated irrigation systems being developed. Those simple ditches you saw before, they're now evolving into complex networks of canals, leading water from the rivers directly to the fields, ensuring stable harvests even when the natural floods were less generous. This required cooperation on a scale never before seen. Imagine dozens, even hundreds, of people working together to dig, maintain, and manage these waterways. It's the ancient equivalent of a massive civil engineering project, without the fancy hard hats or earth movers. Just grit, shovels made of bone or wood, and an incredible amount of collective will. And speaking of cooperation, this need for shared labor and resource management fostered more structured communities. You'd see larger, more organized villages, some beginning to resemble small towns. At their center, a distinct building might emerge, a temple. These weren't just places of worship as we understand them today, but also central hubs for the community. Think of them as the town hall, granary, and spiritual center all rolled into one. They often housed scribes, though writing is still a ways off, remember? Administrators and priests. This indicates a growing social hierarchy, a more complex division of labor than just farmers and potters. Someone needs to manage the temple. Someone needs to oversee the irrigation. And someone needs to make sure everyone is contributing their share to the communal efforts. These Ubaid temples, often built on raised platforms, weren't monumental like the later ziggurats, but they were still impressive for their time. They show a clear focus on the divine, a belief system emerging where the well-being of the community was inextricably linked to the favor of the gods. The people believed that if the gods were happy, the rivers would flood predictably, the crops would flourish, and life would be good. It's a very practical theology, in a way. You're trying to keep the cosmic balance sheet in the black. A quirky tidbit from this period involves the Ubaid figurines. You might encounter strange, elongated clay figurines, often depicting human-like figures with reptilian heads, slanting eyes, and sometimes even nursing children. They're undeniably peculiar. Historians still aren't entirely sure what their purpose was. Were they deities, ancestor figures, child's toys, or perhaps some kind of ritualistic representation? They certainly add a touch of mystery to an otherwise increasingly organized society. Imagine finding one of these in your archaeological dig. It's a bit like discovering a miniature alien in an ancient toy box. The Ubaid culture wasn't confined to Mesopotamia either. Through trade and migration, its influence spread far and wide, reaching into what is now Saudi Arabia and even the Persian Gulf. This tells you that these communities weren't isolated islands, They were connected, exchanging goods, ideas, and perhaps even people. The development of the reed boat in the marshlands, for instance, revolutionized travel along the rivers and even into the Gulf, allowing for greater connectivity. This interconnectedness hints at the foundations of later, more complex economic and political systems. Historians still argue whether the Ubaid culture was truly a unified entity, a single culture spread wide, or if it was more a collection of similar, interconnected local traditions. The evidence can be interpreted both ways, like trying to piece together a story from fragments of conversation. Regardless, what's clear is that the Ubaid period was absolutely crucial. It laid the groundwork, literally with those irrigation canals, for the explosion of urbanism that was about to transform Mesopotamia entirely. It was the training montage before the big show. You can almost feel the quiet hum of progress, a low vibration in the earth, signaling that something monumental is just around the corner. As the Ubaid period drew to a close, that gentle hum of progress you felt began to crescendo into a mighty roar. You're now standing on the precipice of something truly unprecedented in human history, the urban revolution, and at its heart lies a place that will soon become the largest, most bustling city the world has ever seen, Uruk. Imagine stepping out of a sleepy village and directly into Times Square, circa 3200 BCE. The scale, the sheer intensity, is almost dizzying. Uruk isn't just a big village anymore. It's a massive urban center covering hundreds of acres, eventually encompassing a population that swelled into the tens of thousands. Think of it, more people living cheek by jowl than most of us can even imagine in one place at that time. This wasn't a gradual growth like earlier settlements. This was an explosion. What drove it? A perfect storm of factors, really. Improved agricultural techniques meant an even greater surplus of food, which could support more non-farmers. The centralized organization around temples, which you saw emerging in the Ubaid period, only intensified here, drawing people in for protection, work, and spiritual guidance. It's like a magnet, pulling in talent and ambition from the surrounding countryside. The most striking feature of Uruk, the one that would immediately catch your eye and make your jaw drop, is its monumental architecture. Forget those simple mud brick houses. Here, you see colossal temple complexes rising from the flat plains, reaching towards the sky like man-made mountains. The most famous of these is the Iyana district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, and the Anu district, honoring the sky god. These aren't just big buildings. They're expressions of immense power, wealth, and collective effort. Picture vast courtyards, towering walls, and structures built with millions of mud bricks. The White Temple in the Anu district, for instance, stood atop a massive ziggurat-like platform, visible for miles around. Imagine the sheer organizational feat required to construct something like that, quarrying the clay, molding bricks, drying them in the scorching sun, transporting them, and then carefully laying each one. It's a logistical nightmare by modern standards, but they pulled it off. This isn't just a construction project. It's a profound statement. We are here. We are powerful. Our gods are mighty. These temples weren't just religious sites. They were the economic powerhouses of Uruk. They owned vast tracts of land, controlled irrigation systems, employed thousands of people, farmers, artisans, priests, administrators. They acted as gigantic redistribution centers, collecting surplus produce and then doling it out to workers and citizens. It's a centrally planned economy on a grand scale, like the world's first massive corporation, but with deities as the board of directors. With such a large and complex society, social stratification became far more pronounced. You'd see evidence of a clear hierarchy: priests and temple administrators at the top, followed by skilled craftspeople, merchants, and then the vast majority, the farmers and laborers. This wasn't a flat, egalitarian society anymore. It was a pyramid with power concentrated at the very top. Historians still argue about the exact nature of this early hierarchy. Was it primarily religious, economic, or a blend of both that defined who held the most sway? The lines were likely quite blurry. A fascinating, quirky detail from this period is the widespread use of cone mosaics. Imagine pushing tens of thousands of small, baked clay cones, each with a painted head, often red, black, or white, into wet plaster to create intricate geometric patterns on the exterior walls of important buildings. It must have been dazzlingly beautiful when fresh, a vibrant, tactile tapestry of color and shape. It's the ultimate ancient wallpaper, a painstaking process that speaks to both the artistic sensibilities and the sheer labor available in Uruk. The sheer size and density of Uruk also presented new challenges. How do you feed so many people? How do you keep order? How do you manage disputes? These questions spurred further innovations in administration and record-keeping, setting the stage for one of humanity's most revolutionary inventions, which is just peeking over the horizon: the need for managing resources, tracking labor, and recording transactions in a city of this scale became paramount. As you gaze over the bustling panorama of Uruk, you see its influence radiating outwards. Its distinctive pottery, its architectural styles, and its administrative practices spread to surrounding regions, influencing nascent urban centers. Uruk wasn't just big, it was a trendsetter, a beacon of civilization in the ancient world. It's like the first true megacity, a place where people from all walks of life converged, chasing opportunity, seeking the divine, and contributing to a grand, collective enterprise. The very air hums with activity, ambition, and the palpable energy of a civilization reaching for new heights. The sheer scale of Uruk, with its burgeoning population and monumental temples, created a massive problem. How do you keep track of everything? Imagine trying to manage a modern-day Amazon warehouse, but instead of computers and barcodes, you have, well, nothing. No paper, no pens, no iPads, just memory, and maybe a few knotted strings. It quickly became clear that the human brain, remarkable as it is, simply couldn't cope with the vast quantities of grain coming in, the animals being traded, the laborers being paid, and the offerings being made to the gods. This overwhelming administrative need, this mountain of data that simply had to be recorded, spurred one of humanity's most pivotal inventions: writing. You're now witnessing the very dawn of written communication around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, right there in the heart of Uruk. It didn't begin as flowery poetry or grand declarations of kingship. Oh no, it began as something far more mundane, yet infinitely more practical. Accounting. Imagine a frustrated temple administrator, perhaps tearing out their hair, or whatever passed for hair in ancient Mesopotamia, trying to remember exactly how many bushels of barley farmer Nabu brought in last Tuesday. There has to be a better way. You can almost hear them exclaim, and a better way they found. The earliest forms of writing were pictographs, simple pictures representing objects. You'd see a drawing of a head for man, a bowl for food, or a stalk of barley for grain. It's beautifully logical, isn't it? Like a primitive emoji, set designed for inventory management. They weren't scratched on delicate paper, which wouldn't be invented for millennia, but pressed into soft clay tablets using a reed stylus. Imagine the satisfying squish as the stylus made its mark. These clay tablets, once inscribed, were then dried in the sun or baked in kilns, becoming virtually indestructible records that survive to this day. This is why we know so much about Mesopotamia. They were meticulous record keepers. Bless their ancient bureaucratic hearts. At first, these pictographs were purely representational. A picture of an ox meant ox. But quickly, the system evolved. How do you represent to eat, or thirsty, or powerful? This is where the genius comes in. The pictographs began to take on ideographic meanings. A bowl near a mouth might mean to eat. And then, the true leap, they started to represent sounds. This is called the rebus principle, where a picture of an eye might stand for the sound I. It's like when you see a drawing of a bee and a leaf and you think belief. Suddenly you're not just drawing objects, you're drawing the sounds of words. This was a game changer, allowing for the expression of abstract ideas and grammatical elements. This evolving script, which started as simple pictures, gradually became more stylized and abstract. The scribes, working quickly, found it easier to press wedge-shaped marks into the clay rather than meticulously drawing curves and lines. These wedge-shaped marks gave the script its distinctive appearance and its name, cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. It's not a single language, remember, but a system of writing that would be adapted by many different languages over millennia. It's like our alphabet today. It can be used to write English, French, German, and so on. The job of a scribe in Uruk became incredibly important and prestigious. Imagine sitting in a busy temple courtyard, surrounded by stacks of clay tablets, your hands constantly moving, pressing marks into wet clay. It was a specialized skill, requiring years of training, and it elevated its practitioners to an elite status. Being literate meant power, access to information, and a ticket to the upper echelons of society. They were the original data entry specialists, but with much cooler tools and a far greater sense of historical significance. Historians still argue about the precise impetus for this transition from pictograph to phonetic signs. Was it internal scribal innovation or external pressure from a growing diversity of spoken languages? Probably a bit of both, a linguistic melting pot brewing. A quirky detail is that early cuneiform tablets often included cylinder seal impressions. Imagine a small, intricately carved stone cylinder. When rolled across wet clay, it leaves a continuous, repeating image. like a signature or a company logo. These seals were used to authenticate documents, mark ownership, and close jars. It's the ancient world's equivalent of a fingerprint and a padlock all rolled into one, a very sophisticated piece of identity theft prevention for its time. So, while you might think of grand stories when you hear writing, remember its humble, practical origins. It was born out of the sheer, overwhelming need to count, to measure, to administer. But from these mundane beginnings sprang the ability to record history, to tell tales, to codify laws, and to capture the very essence of human thought. The invention of writing wasn't just a technological leap, it was a cognitive revolution, fundamentally changing how humans could interact with information, store knowledge, and transmit it across time and space. Uruk wasn't just a city, it was the birthplace of literacy. With writing firmly established as the ultimate administrative tool, Uruk's dominance, while profound, couldn't last forever. The sprawling urban experiment it pioneered inspired others, and soon the Mesopotamian landscape began to transform into a mosaic of competing urban centers. You're now entering the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, a time characterized by the rise of numerous independent Sumerian city-states. Imagine a highly competitive league of ancient cities, each with its own star players, its king or ruler, its own fan base, its citizens, and a fierce desire to win, gain control over resources, trade routes, and fertile land. Picture this. Every significant city, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur, Eridu, and many more, was essentially its own tiny nation. Each had its own patron deity, its own ruling dynasty, its own bureaucracy, and its own army. It's like the city-states of Renaissance Italy, but thousands of years earlier and with considerably more mud bricks. You'd see massive defensive walls surrounding these urban centers, a clear sign that life wasn't always a picnic in a park. While these cities shared a common Sumerian culture, language, Sumerian, remember, distinct from the Akkadian that would come later, and religious pantheon, they were fiercely independent and often, quite frankly, squabbling. Daily life in these city-states revolved around the temple and the palace. The temple, still a monumental structure, remained the spiritual and economic heart, often dedicated to the city's specific patron god or goddess. Think of the ziggurat of Ur, though that came later in its famous form, as the ultimate expression of this architectural reverence. These religious centers controlled vast estates, managed irrigation, and employed a significant portion of the population. Then there was the palace, the seat of the Lugal king, or Ensi, ruler. The relationship between temple and palace was a complex dance, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, with power shifting between priestly authority and secular rule. Historians still argue about whether the early city-states were primarily theocentric, with priests holding ultimate power, or if a more secular warrior leader quickly emerged as dominant. The evidence suggests a gradual shift, perhaps dependent on the specific city and its needs for defense. And defense was definitely a concern. Conflict was practically a way of life between these rival city-states. Control over water resources, fertile agricultural land, and lucrative trade routes were constant flashpoints. You'd hear tales, perhaps exaggerated, of border skirmishes and outright wars. Imagine marching with your city's army, clad in simple leather or felt armor, armed with copper-tipped spears and axes, ready to defend your harvest or reclaim a disputed canal. These weren't massive empires yet, but localized, intense conflicts. One quirky detail from this period is the stele of the vultures from Lagash, a fascinating victory monument that depicts in brutal detail the triumph of King Yanatum over the neighboring city of Umma. It shows vultures feasting on the bodies of the vanquished enemies, a rather graphic ancient trophy photo. Despite the constant rivalries, trade flourished. The Mesopotamian plain, rich in fertile soil, lacked essential resources like timber, stone, and metals. So, elaborate trade networks developed, connecting these city-states to distant lands. Anatolia for copper, Dilmun, modern Bahrain, for copper and exotic goods, and the Indus Valley for carnelian and other precious materials. You can almost see the caravans, laden with grain, textiles, and finished goods, trudging across the dusty plains, or the reed boats navigating the rivers and the Persian Gulf. This exchange wasn't just about goods. It was about ideas, technologies, and cultural influences, subtly weaving a shared Mesopotamian identity even amidst the political fragmentation. The administrative sophistication honed in Uruk continued to evolve. Cuneiform was now firmly established, and scribes were busy recording not just economic transactions, but also royal inscriptions, legal precedents, and even early literary works. This period gives us some of the earliest recorded laws and proverbs, offering glimpses into their societal values and legal thinking. It's like peeking into their ancient legal textbooks and wisdom literature. As you observe this vibrant, tumultuous period, you realize that despite the fragmentation, something remarkable was being forged. The constant competition, paradoxically, spurred innovation. Each city strove to outdo the others in grandeur, military might, and cultural achievements. This era, with its independent powers and often fierce conflicts, was a crucible for future empires, a proving ground where the foundations of law, governance, and monumental architecture were continually tested and refined. The stage was being set for a figure who would attempt to unite this fractured land. But before that, the echoes of a legendary king from Uruk would resonate through the ages. In the midst of those bickering city-states, a name echoes down through the millennia, a figure so potent he blurred the lines between history and myth. Gilgamesh. You're now delving into the legendary reign of a king who, whether he was a real person or a composite of many, became the subject of humanity's first great epic poem. Imagine sitting by a flickering oil lamp, listening to a storyteller enthrall an ancient Sumerian audience with tales of this mighty ruler of Uruk. His story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, isn't just a bedtime tale. It's a profound exploration of friendship, mortality, and the human search for meaning. So, who was Gilgamesh? According to the Sumerian king list, he was the fifth king of Uruk, reigning for an impossibly long 126 years. Now, we can probably chalk those years up to poetic license, but it suggests he was a figure of immense significance, perhaps a powerful historical king whose deeds were later embellished. He's often depicted as two-thirds god and one-third man, a superhuman figure with incredible strength and ambition. Think of him as the original superhero, but with more existential angst and a serious sidekick. The story begins with Gilgamesh as a tyrannical ruler, oppressing his people in Uruk. He's building walls, yes, but he's also making life pretty miserable for everyone. The citizens complain to the gods, who respond by creating Enkidu, a wild man raised by animals, as a counterbalance. Enkidu is meant to humble Gilgamesh, to be his equal and his challenger. Their initial encounter is a monumental wrestling match that ends in a stalemate. And instead of becoming enemies, they become the closest of friends. This unexpected camaraderie is one of the most enduring themes of the epic, a testament to the power of connection even between the most unlikely individuals. It's like finding your best mate at a bar fight. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu embark on grand adventures, demonstrating the strength and daring of early kings. Their most famous exploits include journeying to the cedar forest to defeat the monstrous guardian Humbaba and cutting down the sacred cedars, an act that, in retrospect, sounds a lot like early resource extraction with divine permission. They then slay the bull of heaven, sent by the goddess Ishtar after Gilgamesh spurns her advances. These are tales of brute force and heroics, designed to entertain and to illustrate the king's prowess. But beneath the surface, there's a growing awareness of consequences. The turning point in the epic, and what elevates it beyond simple heroic adventure, is the death of Enkidu. As punishment for their hubris in killing Humbaba and the bull of heaven, the gods decree that Enkidu must die. Gilgamesh is utterly devastated by the loss of his friend, and this encounter with death profoundly shakes him. He suddenly becomes acutely aware of his own mortality, a fear that drives the latter half of the epic. It's a poignant moment, reminding you that even the most powerful of men eventually face the same fate as everyone else. This fear of death is a mainstream historical fact, woven into the very fabric of ancient Mesopotamian beliefs and practices. From burial rituals to the prayers they offered for a good afterlife. Obsessed with escaping death, Gilgamesh embarks on a desperate quest for immortality. He journeys to the ends of the earth, facing incredible dangers, to find Utnapishtim, the only mortal granted eternal life after surviving a great flood. This flood narrative is a quirky tidbit, one of the earliest flood myths known to humanity, predating later versions found in other ancient texts. It's strikingly similar in many respects, hinting at a shared cultural memory or narrative influence. Gilgamesh eventually finds Utnapishtim, who tells him that immortality is not for mortals, and tests him with a challenge to stay awake. Gilgamesh fails. He is offered a chance at rejuvenation through a magical plant at the bottom of the sea, which he retrieves only for a serpent to steal it while he rests on his journey home. This final disappointment solidifies his understanding. He cannot escape death. The epic ends not with Gilgamesh achieving immortality, but with him returning to Uruk, accepting his fate, and finding solace in the lasting legacy of his city's magnificent walls, which he himself built. He realizes that true immortality lies not in escaping death, but in the enduring impact of one's deeds and the structures one leaves behind. It's a powerful, resonant message that transcends time, and historians still argue whether the Epic of Gilgamesh reflects a growing philosophical shift in Sumerian thought or simply encapsulates long-held beliefs about human limitations. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved on clay tablets, is more than just a story. It's a window into the Sumerian worldview, their values, their fears, and their aspirations. It's a testament to the enduring power of narrative, passed down through generations, shaping the collective identity of a people. As you drift through the echoes of this ancient tale, you can almost hear the soft, rhythmic chant of the storyteller, bringing this legendary king to life. The era of independent city-states, with all their vibrant culture and constant skirmishes, couldn't last forever. The inherent instability of so many competing powers, constantly vying for supremacy, begged for a unifying force. And that force arrived, not from one of the established Sumerian strongholds, but from an unexpected quarter, ushering in a new age, the Akkadian Empire, forged by the legendary Sargon. You're about to witness the birth of the world's first true empire, a monumental shift in how power was conceived and exercised. Imagine a man rising from seemingly humble origins. The myths say he was a cupbearer to a king in Kish, perhaps even a gardener. His name, Sargon, means legitimate king, which usually means he wasn't and needed to assert his claim quite loudly. What we know for sure is that around 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad, possibly from a region just north of Sumer, began a meteoric rise. He wasn't Sumerian. He spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language, marking a significant cultural and linguistic shift in Mesopotamia. This makes him something of an outsider, which often means he sees things differently, with fresh eyes and a ruthless ambition. Sargon didn't just conquer cities, he systematically dismantled the old order of independent city-states. His military campaigns were swift, decisive, and relentless. He developed new tactics, possibly emphasizing disciplined infantry formations over the more traditional chaotic skirmishes of earlier Sumerian armies. You can almost hear the rhythmic tramp of his soldiers, the clash of copper weapons, as city after city fell before his might. He didn't just defeat kings, he replaced them with his own governors, often family members, ensuring loyalty and direct control. It's the original centralization of power playbook, and Sargon wrote the first chapter. His methods were effective, if brutal. He established Akkad as his capital city. Its exact location is still a mystery, a quirky tidbit that keeps archaeologists on their toes, searching for its legendary ruins somewhere near modern Baghdad. From Akkad, he ruled a vast territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, encompassing not just Sumer, but Elam to the east and parts of Syria and Anatolia to the west. This wasn't just a kingdom. It was an empire, an unprecedented expanse of unified territory under a single ruler. Think about the logistical challenge. How do you govern such a diverse and far-flung domain without modern communication? Sargon's solution involved a clever mix of military presence, administrative innovation, and cultural integration. He maintained a standing army, ready to quell rebellions. He standardized weights and measures, making trade and taxation easier across his vast realm. He promoted the use of the Akkadian language alongside Sumerian, though cuneiform writing continued to be used for both. He even appointed his daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur, a brilliant political move that merged religious authority with imperial power, subtly weaving the new regime into the spiritual fabric of the land. Enheduanna herself was a significant figure, the earliest named author in history, composing beautiful hymns and prayers. The rise of Akkad meant a shift in artistic style, too. While Sumerian art often featured serene, dignified figures, Akkadian art, particularly the famous Stele of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, celebrates the triumphant, powerful king, almost a divine figure himself. Naram-Sin is depicted trampling his enemies, wearing a horned helmet usually reserved for deities. It's a very clear message: don't mess with the Akkad king. This grand, propagandistic art is a mainstream historical fact, showcasing how art served imperial ambitions. Sargon's reign, lasting for over 50 years, brought a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity to Mesopotamia. Trade routes were secured, resources flowed more freely, and artistic and intellectual pursuits flourished under imperial patronage. For the first time, people identified not just as citizens of Ur or Lagash, but as subjects of the Akkadian Empire. This fostered a new sense of identity, albeit one enforced by military might. Historians still argue whether Sargon's empire was a truly integrated state or more of a loose confederation held together by force. While he undeniably brought a new level of centralization, managing such a vast empire without modern infrastructure was incredibly challenging. Maintaining control over rebellious elements, especially after his death, proved to be the empire's Achilles heel. Despite its eventual decline, Sargon's reign set a powerful precedent. He demonstrated that a single ruler could unite the disparate lands of Mesopotamia, laying the ideological and practical groundwork for all future empires that would rise and fall in the region. The dream of a unified Mesopotamia, even if temporary, was born. Sargon's grand vision of a unified empire, forged with such ruthless efficiency, couldn't defy gravity forever. Like all great endeavors born of human ambition, the Akkadian Empire eventually faced its challenges. You're now witnessing a period of decline and disruption, often referred to as the Gutian Interregnum, roughly from 2154 to 2112 BCE. Imagine a mighty dam that's held back a massive river finally beginning to crack and crumble. The stability Sargon had imposed starts to give way, and chaos, like floodwaters, begins to seep back into the land. After the long and glorious reign of Sargon, and then his powerful grandson Naram-Sin, the empire began to weaken. Successive Akkadian kings struggled to maintain control over such a vast and diverse territory. Rebellions flared up in various regions, and the administrative machinery, once so efficient, began to grind down. The very size of the empire, once its greatest strength, became its greatest vulnerability. It was simply too big, too complex, and too reliant on the singular strength of its ruler to hold together indefinitely without modern communication or transportation. It's like trying to manage a global corporation with nothing but carrier pigeons and very strong lungs. Then came the Gutians. These were a people from the Zagros Mountains to the east, often described in Mesopotamian texts as a horde or a barbarous people who knew no kingship. This is, of course, the perspective of the urbanized Mesopotamians, who found their ways uncouth and their presence disruptive. You can almost hear the lamentations of the scribes, bewailing the arrival of these mountain dwellers who cared little for the sophisticated ways of the cities. Historians still argue about the true extent of the Gutian invasion and whether it was a full-scale conquest or more of a gradual infiltration and opportunistic raiding. It's likely their impact varied region by region, like a patchy thunderstorm moving across the land. The Gutians didn't establish a centralized empire of their own. Rather, their arrival seems to have plunged much of Mesopotamia back into a fragmented state. Akkadian power crumbled, and the land was once again divided among local rulers and opportunistic strongmen. Cities that had been forced into submission by Sargon now reasserted their independence. It was a period of instability, marked by economic disruption, a decline in monumental building projects, and a general sense of unease. Imagine the vibrant trade routes, once secured by Akkadian might, now becoming dangerous bandit havens. For the ordinary farmer or artisan, this likely meant increased hardship. Taxation might have been less centralized, but security certainly declined. You'd probably worry more about raids on your crops or livestock, and the grand projects that once provided employment might have ceased. The cultural output, so vibrant under Akkad, seems to have diminished during this period. It's a bit like a cultural dark age, where the lights of centralized power flickered and dimmed. A quirky tidbit from this period is the widespread laments and curses found in Mesopotamian texts, blaming the Gutians for everything from bad harvests to the collapse of social order. These texts paint a picture of utter despair and chaos. One famous text describes how the Gutian hordes carried off the kingship to the mountains. They brought down the reverence for the gods. They brought down the kingship of Sumer. It's a very dramatic portrayal, certainly not unbiased, but it captures the sense of disruption and resentment that the Mesopotamians felt towards their invaders. Despite the widespread perception of chaos, some local Sumerian city-states managed to maintain a degree of autonomy and even flourish, particularly in the south. Lagash, for instance, saw the reign of a king named Gudea, a pious ruler who rebuilt temples and commissioned exquisite statues of himself. These statues, carved from imported diorite, showcase a return to some Sumerian artistic traditions, focusing on piety and devotion rather than raw military might. It's a testament to the resilience of Sumerian culture, persisting even when the overarching political structure had collapsed. Gudea's reign is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating that not all was lost during this tumultuous time. The Gudean interregnum, while often portrayed as a period of unmitigated disaster, was ultimately temporary. It was a necessary pause, a chaotic interlude that cleared the stage for a new act. The memory of the unified Akkadian Empire, however fractured and distant, would linger, fueling the ambitions of future rulers who dreamed of reunifying Mesopotamia. The ground was being prepared, perhaps through the very hardship of this era, for a grand Sumerian resurgence, a final golden age before new powers would irrevocably alter the Mesopotamian landscape. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief as the Gutian hold begins to loosen. The chaotic winds of the Gutian interregnum eventually began to die down, revealing a landscape eager for order once more. And out of that very chaos, a powerful new force emerged, not from a foreign land, but from the heart of Sumer itself. You're now entering the magnificent era of the Ur-3 Renaissance, roughly 2112 to 2004 BCE, a period often described as the last great Sumerian dynasty. Imagine a brilliant star emerging from behind dark clouds, illuminating the land with renewed splendor, and perhaps more surprisingly, an intense focus on bureaucracy. At the forefront of this resurgence was the city of Ur, a city you might remember as an early Sumerian powerhouse. Its kings, particularly Ur-Nammu, rose to prominence, driving out the last vestiges of Gutian control and consolidating power across Mesopotamia. Ur-Nammu wasn't just a conqueror, he was a lawgiver, famously compiling one of the earliest known law codes, predating Hammurabi's by centuries. This code, preserved on a clay tablet, outlines laws concerning property, injury, and family, reflecting a desire to restore order and justice after the preceding instability. This act of codifying laws is a mainstream historical fact, showcasing a profound leap in administrative and legal sophistication. Under Ur-Nammu and his successors, especially Shulgi, the Ur-Thrid Empire became a highly centralized and incredibly well-organized state. This wasn't the loose, militarily enforced empire of Sargon. This was a meticulously managed, almost obsessively documented state. Think of it as ancient Mesopotamia's version of a highly efficient, if somewhat stifling, corporate empire. Every aspect of life, from agricultural output to the number of sheep in a flock, seems to have been meticulously recorded. This era is a goldmine for archaeologists because of the sheer volume of cuneiform tablets recovered, detailing everything from temple inventories to labor contracts. It's like their ancient version of big data, long before computers were even a twinkle in anyone's eye. The economy of Ur-Third was centrally planned, with the state owning vast tracts of land and controlling much of the production and distribution. Farmers cultivated specific crops, artisans produced goods, and all surplus flowed into vast state granaries and storehouses. This output was then redistributed to workers and officials as rations or used for trade. You can almost see the scribes, perched on stools in dimly lit temple offices, endlessly scratching away on clay tablets, tallying every single sheep, every bushel of grain, every labor hour. It was a massive, top-down system designed for maximum efficiency and control. This intense focus on bureaucracy is one of the defining characteristics of Ur III. The empire was divided into provinces, each overseen by a governor. A sophisticated system of taxation and tribute ensured that resources flowed smoothly to the capital. They even had a specialized postal system for official communications. Imagine the sheer number of civil servants required to run such a complex apparatus. Historians still argue whether this pervasive state control was a golden age of stability and prosperity for the common person, or if it led to oppression and a stifling of individual initiative. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle, depending on your lot in life. A quirky tidbit from this period is the existence of detailed administrative documents listing things like the number of workers assigned to particular tasks, down to the exact amount of barley they were to receive as daily rations. You can find tablets that specify, for example, how many man days it took to dig a certain length of canal, or the precise amount of sesame oil given to a particular weaver. It's an ancient HR department's dream or nightmare, depending on your perspective. This granular detail gives us an unprecedented look into the daily lives and labor practices of ancient Mesopotamians. The Ur-3 period also saw a resurgence in monumental building, particularly the construction of impressive ziggurats. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, though extensively restored in modern times, is a prime example of this architectural ambition. Imagine a massive stepped tower, built of millions of mud bricks, rising majestically above the city, its upper sanctuary dedicated to the moon god Nana. It served not just as a religious center, but also as a symbol of the state's power and its connection to the divine. Building these colossal structures required incredible organization and a vast labor force, all meticulously accounted for by those diligent scribes. The Ur-the kings were not just administrators, they were also patrons of the arts and literature, fostering a final flowering of Sumerian culture. Sumerian language was revived in official inscriptions and literary works, even as Akkadian continued to be spoken by much of the population. It was a conscious effort to reclaim and celebrate their cultural heritage after the foreign Gutian interlude. Yet, despite its incredible organization and apparent strength, the Ur-3 Empire, like the Akkadian before it, eventually faced its own challenges. Internal pressures, coupled with external threats from nomadic groups, like the Amorites, who are just on the horizon, began to erode its power. But for a century, Ur-3 stood as a testament to the enduring genius of Sumerian civilization, showcasing an unparalleled mastery of centralized governance and bureaucratic control that would influence states for millennia to come. The meticulously organized, almost perfectly bureaucratized world of the Ur-3 Empire, despite its impressive grandeur, couldn't maintain its iron grip forever. Empires, even the most efficient ones, are subject to external pressures and internal weaknesses. You're now witnessing a period of significant demographic and political change, driven largely by the Amorite migrations, which would reshape the Mesopotamian landscape once again. Imagine the tightly woven tapestry of Ur-3 beginning to unravel, thread by thread, as new patterns are introduced by outside forces. From the western deserts, nomadic groups known as the Amorites had been steadily migrating into Mesopotamia for centuries. They were a Semitic-speaking people, pastoralists who moved with their flocks, much like earlier nomadic groups. But unlike the Gutians, who were largely seen as destructive raiders, the Amorites were more of a gradual, persistent infiltration. They weren't necessarily invading. They were settling, often peacefully at first, integrating into the existing societal fabric. However, their increasing numbers and distinct way of life put pressure on the established order. It's like a slow, steady stream of new neighbors moving into a well-established community. Eventually, things are going to change. The decline of the Ur-III Empire was multifaceted. Economic strain, likely exacerbated by severe droughts and crop failures, weakened the central authority. The over-reliance on a highly centralized system meant that when that system faltered, it created widespread instability. And then there were the Amorites, whose presence along the western borders became increasingly assertive. Eventually, around 2004 BCE, a combination of internal strife and external pressure from the Elamites, from the east, and the encroaching Amorites led to the ultimate collapse of Ur III. The great ziggurat of Ur was sacked, and its last king carried off into captivity. It was a dramatic end to the final Sumerian Golden Age. With the collapse of Ur III, Mesopotamia once again fragmented into a mosaic of independent city-states, but with a crucial difference. Many of Ai's new city-states were now ruled by Amorite dynasties. These weren't necessarily foreign rulers in the traditional sense. Many Amorites had been living within Mesopotamia for generations, serving in armies or working as laborers. They adopted Mesopotamian culture, including the cuneiform script. The language, Akkadian, became dominant, though Sumerian was still used for religious and scholarly texts, and the religious pantheon. However, they brought their own tribal traditions and a new dynamism to the political scene. You'd see the rise of powerful new urban centers under Amorite leadership. Cities like Isin and Larsa initially vied for supremacy in the south, attempting to claim the mantle of Ur III's legacy. Further north, other Amorite leaders established powerful kingdoms in cities such as Mari on the Euphrates, a major trade hub, and Assur on the Tigris, the future heartland of Assyria. But the city that would ultimately rise to unparalleled prominence, largely under Amorite rule, was a relatively minor town you might barely have noticed before: Babylon. Imagine Babylon, a small regional center for centuries, suddenly gaining strategic importance. Its location on the Euphrates, at a crossroads of trade routes, made it an ideal candidate for growth. Under a succession of ambitious Amorite kings, Babylon began to expand its influence, slowly but steadily absorbing surrounding territories. These new Amorite kings, unlike the meticulous bureaucrats of Ur III, often emphasize their military prowess and personal charisma. They were more akin to tribal chieftains on a grand scale, balancing alliances and rivalries with neighboring powers. A quirky tidbit from this period is the fascinating correspondence found in the archives of Mari. These cuneiform tablets reveal a complex web of diplomacy, espionage, and shifting alliances between the various Amorite-ruled kingdoms. Kings would write to each other with elaborate greetings and complaints, discussing everything from military maneuvers to the proper etiquette for receiving a diplomatic envoy. It's like peeking into the ancient world's geopolitical chat room, full of polite formalities, masking intense power struggles. This period, often called the Old Babylonian period, though it encompasses many other kingdoms, was characterized by dynamic competition. Kings constantly expanded their territories, built new city walls, and dug elaborate irrigation canals to secure their agricultural bases. The focus shifted from the centralized control of Ur III to a more decentralized system of competing regional powers. Historians still argue whether this fragmentation was a natural consequence of the empire's collapse, or if the Amorite emphasis on tribal loyalties inherently led to a more splintered political landscape. Likely, it was a complex interplay of both factors. As you observe these powerful new city-states, each with its ambitious Amorite ruler, you can feel the tension in the air. The stage is being set for yet another attempt at unification, a new empire that would, for a time, bring a different kind of order to Mesopotamia. And its most famous architect would be a name that still resonates through the halls of history, a king whose laws would define an era. The meticulously organized, almost perfectly bureaucratized world of the Ur-III Empire, despite its impressive grandeur, couldn't maintain its iron grip forever. Empires, even the most efficient ones, are subject to external pressures and internal weaknesses. You're now witnessing a period of significant demographic and political change, driven largely by the Amorite migrations, which would reshape the Mesopotamian landscape once again. Imagine the tightly woven tapestry of Ur III beginning to unravel, thread by thread, as new patterns are introduced by outside forces. The fragmented landscape created by the Amorite migrations and the fall of Ur-III was a volatile one, a chessboard with many ambitious kings vying for supremacy. But among these emerging powers, one city, Babylon, and one king would rise above the rest, forging an empire that would define an era. You're now entering the reign of Hammurabi of Babylon, around 1792 to 1750 BCE, a figure whose name is synonymous with law and order in ancient Mesopotamia. Imagine a skilled diplomat and fierce warrior who, after years of careful maneuvering, finally achieves mastery over a sprawling realm. When Hammurabi ascended to the throne of Babylon, it was still one among many Amorite city-states, albeit a growing one. He didn't immediately launch into grand conquests. Instead, for the first 2 decades of his reign, he focused on internal development. He was a meticulous administrator, a builder of canals, and a restorer of temples. He secured Babylon's position, ensuring its agricultural base was strong and its defenses robust. This patient, strategic foundation laying is a mainstream historical fact, often overlooked in favor of his later military successes, but crucial for understanding his ultimate triumph. It's like a chess master patiently developing their pieces before unleashing a devastating attack. Then, around his 30th year as king, Hammurabi began his decisive military campaigns. He skillfully played his rivals against each other, forging alliances only to break them when opportune, always with an eye on Babylon's ultimate ascendancy. He systematically defeated kingdoms like Larsa, Mari, and Eshnunna, bringing vast swaths of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control. His military prowess wasn't just about brute force, it was about clever strategy, often involving diverting rivers to besiege cities or cut off their water supply. You can almost feel the nervous anticipation in rival palaces as news of Hammurabi's expanding domain reached their ears. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi had created a vast and cohesive Babylonian empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to Mari in the north. This wasn't just a loose collection of conquered territories. It was a relatively unified state, managed directly from Babylon. He established a network of loyal governors, ensured regular tax collection, and maintained a strong military presence to keep the peace. But what Hammurabi is most famous for, what truly cemented his legacy, is his comprehensive set of laws. The Code of Hammurabi. Imagine a towering black basalt stele, nearly 8 feet tall, inscribed with over 282 laws, presented as if directly handed to Hammurabi by Shamash, the god of justice. This is a powerful piece of propaganda, asserting divine backing for the king's authority. This code wasn't the first law code in Mesopotamia, remember Ur-Nammus? But it was by far the most extensive and influential, offering a detailed glimpse into old Babylonian society, its values, and its legal system. The laws covered every aspect of daily life: family law, property law, trade regulations, and penalties for various offenses. They were often characterized by the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, though this was applied with varying degrees of severity depending on the social status of those involved. A quirky tidbit is that the code prescribed specific penalties for negligent barbers. If a barber accidentally cut off a slave's ear, he faced a fine. Fraudulent builders. If a house collapsed and killed its owner, the builder was put to death, and even runaway slaves. Anyone harboring one faced death. It's a remarkably detailed glimpse into the intricacies of their daily lives and their attempts to create a fair, or at least orderly, society. Historians still argue about the precise purpose of the Code of Hammurabi. Was it a strict set of laws to be applied literally in every court case, or was it more of a grand legal treatise, a statement of principles, and a demonstration of Hammurabi's wisdom and justice? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. It certainly served as a guide for judges and as a powerful symbol of royal authority and the rule of law. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became a cultural and intellectual center. Astronomical observations were meticulously recorded, mathematical knowledge advanced, and literary works, including revised versions of the Gilgamesh epic, continued to be produced. The city itself flourished, adorned with new temples and palaces, becoming a symbol of order and centralized power. You can almost envision the bustling streets, the aroma of spices from distant lands, and the murmur of legal debates in temple courts. Hammurabi's reign was a high point for ancient Mesopotamia, a period of stability and organized governance after centuries of fragmentation. He didn't just conquer, he codified, organized, and built, laying foundations that would influence future civilizations. But even Hammurabi's carefully constructed empire, strong as it seemed, contained the seeds of its own eventual decline, destined to face new threats from unexpected directions. Even the most meticulously crafted empires, built on the solid foundations of law and military might, are ultimately vulnerable to the shifting tides of history. Hammurabi's glorious Babylonian empire, despite its strength, would eventually face its own moment of crisis, ushering in a period of decline and a new wave of foreign influence. You're now witnessing the Hittite sack of Babylon around 1595 BCE and the subsequent, more enduring Kassite rule. Imagine a sudden, sharp tremor that shakes the foundations, followed by a long, slow change in the landscape. After Hammurabi's death, the empire he had so painstakingly built began to fray. His successors, while capable, simply couldn't maintain the same level of centralized control over such a vast territory. Internal squabbles among various Amorite factions and the persistent pressure from rebellious regions weakened the core. It's a classic imperial problem, easy to conquer, harder to keep. The mighty bureaucratic machine Hammurabi had perfected began to groan under its own weight, and the further away you got from the capital, the less direct the king's authority felt. The final blow to the old Babylonian Empire came from an unexpected direction. The Hittites. These were an Indo-European speaking people from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, a powerful kingdom far to the northwest. Their king, Mursili I, launched a daring long-distance raid that culminated in the sack of Babylon. This wasn't a sustained conquest aimed at occupation. It was a devastating smash and grab. The Hittites swept in, plundered the city, carried off valuable treasures, including the statues of the city's patron gods, a huge symbolic blow, and then promptly retreated back to Anatolia. Imagine a devastating hurricane making landfall, causing immense damage, and then just moving on, leaving behind ruin and a power vacuum. This sudden, brutal attack is a mainstream historical fact, marking the definitive end of the old Babylonian dynasty. The Hittite raid left Babylon in ruins and Mesopotamia in disarray. The power vacuum created by the collapse of Hammurabi's line and the Hittite withdrawal allowed for the gradual emergence of new players, and this is where the Kassites enter the picture. Like the Amorites before them, the Kassites were a group from the Zagros Mountains, to the east of Mesopotamia. They had been migrating into the region for some time, initially as laborers, soldiers, or tribal groups seeking pasture land. Unlike the destructive Hittites, the Kassites moved in more gradually, slowly establishing their presence in the political landscape. Over the next few centuries, the Kassites rose to dominance not through a single dramatic conquest like Sargon or Hammurabi, but through a more subtle, persistent process of infiltration and consolidation. They established a new dynasty in Babylon that would rule for over 400 years, from roughly 1595 to 1155 BCE, one of the longest-lasting dynasties in Mesopotamian history. Imagine a new, quieter, but incredibly persistent current gradually replacing the old one in a river. The Kassite period in Mesopotamia is often called a Dark Age by earlier historians due to a perceived lack of monumental inscriptions and grand narratives compared to the earlier periods. However, modern scholarship paints a more nuanced picture. While they may not have produced the colossal ziggurats or sweeping epic poems of their predecessors, the Kassites were effective rulers who brought a period of relative stability to Babylon and its surrounding regions after the chaos of the Hittite sack. They meticulously rebuilt temples, restored order, and fostered a renewed sense of urban life. A quirky tidbit is that the Kassites introduced the use of the horse and chariot to Mesopotamia on a larger scale for military purposes. While the horse had been known before, its widespread adoption as a war machine under the Kassites revolutionized warfare and transportation. Imagine the awe and terror of seeing these swift, powerful chariots thundering across the battlefield for the first time. It's like the introduction of tanks in ancient warfare. Culturally, the Kassites largely adopted and preserved Mesopotamian traditions. They continued to use Akkadian as the administrative language. They worshipped the Sumerian Akkadian pantheon, and they patronized scribal schools. While they didn't impose their own culture, they integrated elements of it. For instance, they introduced new personal names and some new deities into the pantheon. This period also saw the development of kuduras, which are inscribed stone boundary markers that recorded land grants from the king, often decorated with symbols of the gods who blessed the transaction. These are important mainstream historical facts, offering insights into land ownership and legal practices. Historians still argue about the true nature of cacique rule. Was it a period of stagnation or one of quiet consolidation and cultural preservation? While it might lack the dramatic flair of earlier periods, the Kassite era was crucial for maintaining the continuity of Mesopotamian civilization, acting as a bridge between the Old Babylonian period and the later rise of powerful Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires. They kept the lights on, so to speak, preserving the knowledge and traditions until the next great power emerged. The long, quiet reign of the Kassites, a period of steady, if unspectacular, consolidation, eventually began to wane. As their power gradually receded, new forces stirred in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, forces that would fundamentally redefine warfare and empire. You're now witnessing the dawn of a truly formidable power, the Assyrians, and their relentless rise during the Iron Age. Imagine a quiet, mountainous region to the north, previously a bit player, now flexing its muscles and preparing to dominate the entire stage. For centuries, Assyria, centered around the city of Assur on the Tigris River, had been a regional power, sometimes independent, sometimes subject to larger empires like Ur-Thi or Babylon. Its people were Akkadian speakers, deeply religious, and known for their martial spirit, honed by constant skirmishes with mountain tribes and rival city-states. But it was the technological leap of ironworking that truly transformed them into an unstoppable force. You can almost hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, forging weapons tougher and more readily available than the bronze arms that had dominated warfare for millennia. This widespread adoption of iron, though the exact timeline for its full integration into Assyrian military is a subject historians still debate, gave them a significant advantage. The shift to iron was a game changer. Bronze, a mix of copper and tin, was expensive, and its components had to be sourced from distant lands. Iron ore, on the other hand, was much more common. This meant that a large, well-equipped army could be fielded more easily. Imagine equipping every soldier with a sharp, durable iron sword and spear, rather than precious and often brittle bronze. This practical advantage, a mainstream historical fact, played a crucial role in Assyria's military success. The Assyrians weren't just technologically advanced, they were masters of military organization and strategy. They developed highly disciplined armies, featuring specialized units like chariotry, cavalry. They were early adopters of mounted warfare, archers, and siege engineers. They perfected siege warfare using sophisticated techniques like sapping, battering rams, and siege ramps to breach even the most formidable city walls. You can almost feel the dread that must have struck the hearts of their enemies as the Assyrian war machine approached. They were meticulous planners, often conducting psychological warfare before even reaching a city, spreading tales of their brutality to encourage surrender. This initial phase of Assyrian expansion, sometimes called the Middle Assyrian Empire, roughly 1400 to 1000 BCE, saw them assert control over northern Mesopotamia and parts of Syria. Kings like Ashur-uballit I pushed back against the fading Kassite power and challenged the dominant kingdoms of Mitanni to their west and the Hittites. They began to establish themselves as a major regional player, a force to be reckoned with. They were hungry for resources, eager to secure trade routes, and driven by a strong sense of divine mission, believing their god Ashur commanded them to expand their dominion. A quirky tidbit is the Assyrians' elaborate use of propaganda through their royal inscriptions and relief sculptures. Kings meticulously recorded their campaigns, detailing the cities they conquered, the tribute they exacted, and often the brutal fates of their enemies. These inscriptions, carved on palace walls and stelae, were not just historical records. They were powerful statements designed to instill awe and fear, both in their own subjects and in potential adversaries. Imagine reading a king's boast about flaying rebels and piling up their skulls. It certainly sends a message. Despite their growing power, the Middle Assyrian period faced challenges. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age system around 1200 BCE, often attributed to the mysterious Sea Peoples and widespread societal upheaval across the Near East, caused a temporary retrenchment for Assyria. For a while, they focused on defending their core territory, weathering the storm that brought down many other great powers. Historians still argue about the precise balance between military might, religious ideology, and administrative efficiency in explaining the sustained rise of Assyria. Was it primarily their superior army, their fervent devotion to Ashur, or their increasingly sophisticated bureaucratic system that allowed them to endure and eventually flourish where others failed? It's likely a complex interplay of all these factors, each feeding into the other, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of power and expansion. But this temporary pause was just that, a pause. The experience of defending their heartland during this chaotic period only hardened the Assyrians, refining their military and administrative techniques. They were learning, adapting, and preparing for their grand act on the world stage. The stage was being set for the next, even more formidable, phase of Assyrian dominance, one that would leave an indelible mark on the memory of the ancient Near East. You can almost feel the ground vibrating with the approach of their chariots. The temporary retrenchment of the Middle Assyrian period was merely a prelude, a strategic pause before the main event. You are now entering the terrifying and awe-inspiring era of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, roughly from 911 to 609 BCE, a period where their military machine reached its peak, dominating the ancient Near East like no power before them. Imagine a meticulously oiled, unstoppable war machine, systematically crushing all opposition and leaving a trail of both devastation and highly organized administration in its wake. This was an empire built on relentless military might, unmatched in its day. The Neo-Assyrians perfected the art of total warfare. Their army was a professional, highly trained force, featuring specialized units like heavy cavalry, chariotry, archers, and a truly fearsome siege corps. They invented and refined siege engines, battering rams that shattered city gates, mobile towers that allowed soldiers to scale walls, and sophisticated sapping techniques to undermine defenses. You can almost hear the rhythmic thump of a battering ram against stone, a sound that surely struck terror into the hearts of besieged populations. This military innovation and efficiency is a mainstream historical fact, vividly documented in their own records and archaeological remains. But it wasn't just about brute force. The Assyrians also excelled at psychological warfare. They meticulously recorded their conquests and the brutal fates of those who resisted him, then disseminated these tales and carved them into vivid palace reliefs. Imagine seeing images of impaled captives or piles of skulls etched into the walls of a conquered city, a chilling warning to anyone considering rebellion. This was a deliberate strategy to break the will of their enemies before the battle even began. They were masters of intimidation long before anyone understood the concept of shock and awe. Their empire stretched from Egypt to Iran, encompassing lands as diverse as Syria, Palestine, Babylonia, and parts of Anatolia. To control such a vast domain, they developed an incredibly sophisticated and ruthless administration. Conquered territories were organized into provinces, each with a governor loyal to the king. Resources flowed continuously to the Assyrian heartland through a highly effective taxation and tribute system. They also engaged in mass deportation, forcibly relocating hundreds of thousands of conquered people to different parts of the empire. While this sounds incredibly cruel, and it served a dual purpose. It removed rebellious populations from their homelands, thus breaking their identity and ability to organize resistance, and it provided a cheap labor force for massive building projects and agricultural endeavors across the empire. It's like a forced, ancient version of population resettlement, a grim but effective tool of control. Kings like Ashur-Nasir-Pal II, Shalmaneser III, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal became legendary for their conquests and their administrative prowess. Ashurbanipal, in particular, was not just a warrior, but also a scholar. A quirky tidbit, he famously built a vast library in Nineveh, his capital, meticulously collecting and copying tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets from across Mesopotamia. This was not just a personal hobby. It was a deliberate act of preserving the ancient knowledge of the region, including epics like Gilgamesh, historical annals, omens, and scholarly texts. Without his passion for collecting these tablets, much of what we know about ancient Mesopotamia would have been lost to time. It's like having an ancient superlibrarian with a penchant for conquest. The Neo-Assyrian capital cities, Nimrud, Khorsabad, and especially Nineveh, became showcases of imperial power and wealth. You'd see massive palaces adorned with intricate alabaster reliefs depicting military campaigns, hunting scenes, and religious rituals. Colossal winged, human-headed bulls, known as lamassu, guarded their gates, symbolizing the king's power and divine protection. Imagine walking through the imposing gates of Nineveh, feeling dwarfed by these magnificent, powerful guardians. Despite their overwhelming military superiority and sophisticated administration, the Neo-Assyrian Empire faced constant rebellions. Their harsh policies, especially deportation and heavy taxation, bred deep resentment among conquered peoples. This meant they were constantly campaigning, stretching their resources and their manpower. Historians still argue whether the empire's ultimate collapse was due primarily to overextension and internal revolts, or if it was more a consequence of the rise of powerful new external enemies like the Babylonians and the Medes. It was likely a combination of these factors. A powerful empire finally buckling under the weight of its own success and the fury of its subjugated peoples. But for over 3 centuries, the Neo-Assyrians were the undisputed masters of the ancient Near East, leaving an enduring legacy of military innovation, administrative efficiency, and, perhaps most notably, a stark reminder of the costs of imperial ambition. Their very name, Assyria, would become synonymous with ruthless power and conquest in the memories of those who lived under their iron heel. The mighty roar of the Neo-Assyrian war machine, which had echoed across the Near East for centuries, was not destined to last forever. Empires, no matter how formidable, carry the seeds of their own destruction within them, whether it's overextension, internal dissent, or the rise of new, determined adversaries. You're now witnessing the dramatic collapse of the seemingly invincible Assyrian Empire and the stunning return of Babylon to a position of power. Imagine a proud ancient city, long subjugated, seizing its moment to rise from the ashes. The Assyrians, for all their military prowess and administrative genius, had cultivated a vast harvest of resentment. Their brutal policies of mass deportation, heavy taxation, and public display of cruelty, while effective in the short term, created a deep-seated hatred among the conquered peoples. The empire was constantly battling rebellions, stretching its resources and manpower. It was a vicious cycle. More rebellion meant more brutal suppression, which in turn fueled more resentment. It's like trying to hold down a spring-loaded jack-in-the-box. Eventually, it's going to pop. The cracks in the Assyrian edifice began to show. Long wars against Elam to the east and the persistent campaigns against Urartu in the north drained their treasury and thinned their armies. Then, 2 formidable powers, long chafing under Assyrian dominance, formed a decisive alliance: the Babylonians and the Medes. The Babylonians, particularly under the leadership of Nabopolassar, a Chaldean chief who proclaimed himself king of Babylon in 626 BCE, were determined to reclaim their ancient glory. They had endured centuries of Assyrian oversight, sometimes outright rule, and the desire for independence burned fiercely. The Medes, an Indo-Iranian people from the highlands to the east, were also growing in strength and were eager to expand their own influence. This alliance was a strategic masterstroke, combining the resurgent power of the south with the mountain strength of the east. The final decisive campaign against Assyria began in earnest. The Allied forces systematically attacked the Assyrian heartland. You can almost feel the collective cheer ripple across the subjugated lands as news spread of Assyrian defeats. City after city fell, culminating in the siege and destruction of the very heart of the empire, its magnificent capitals. First, Ashur fell in 614 BCE. Then, the unthinkable happened. Nineveh, the seemingly impregnable capital, the jewel of the Assyrian Empire, was besieged and sacked in 612 BCE. Imagine the shockwaves this sent throughout the ancient world. The city that had inspired so much fear and awe, with its colossal walls and grand palaces, was utterly destroyed. Its vast library, assembled by Ashurbanipal, was buried under the rubble, paradoxically preserving its contents for millennia. This catastrophic fall of Nineveh is a mainstream historical fact, vividly described in contemporary chronicles and archaeological findings. It's like the ultimate historical mic drop. The fall of Nineveh marked the definitive end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Its remnants were swiftly absorbed by the victors, and the memory of its brutality would linger for centuries. But from its ashes rose the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a powerful and glorious successor. Under Nabopolassar and his incredibly famous son, Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was restored to a splendor perhaps even surpassing its old Babylonian heyday. This period marked a significant shift in the balance of power. The Medes and Babylonians carved up the former Assyrian territories, with Babylon gaining control over much of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. The focus shifted back to the ancient city on the Euphrates. The Neo-Babylonian kings, conscious of their long and storied heritage, embarked on massive building projects, transforming Babylon into a truly awe-inspiring metropolis. A quirky tidbit from this period is the widespread practice of sacred prostitution or temple service by women in Babylonian society. While often sensationalized, it reflected complex religious and social roles, including the dedication of daughters to temples and their involvement in various sacred rites and economic activities within the temple complexes. Historians still argue about the exact nature and prevalence of these practices and how they relate to modern understandings of prostitution, but it undeniably offers a glimpse into a very different social fabric. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, though shorter-lived than its Assyrian predecessor, was a powerful and culturally vibrant force. It was a time when the ancient traditions of Mesopotamia were consciously revived and celebrated, combined with a renewed imperial ambition. You can almost hear the triumphant shouts in the streets of Babylon as the news of Assyria's downfall spread and the city began to rebuild itself, not just physically, but spiritually and politically, ready for its final, dazzling act on the world stage. With the Assyrian behemoth finally laid to rest, Babylon, under its new Chaldean dynasty, seized its moment to reclaim its ancient glory. You're now immersed in the breathtaking splendor of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, particularly during the reign of its most famous king, Nebuchadnezzar II, from 605 to 562 BCE. Imagine a city that, almost overnight, transforms into the most magnificent metropolis the ancient world has ever seen. A true marvel of engineering, art, and imperial power. Nebuchadnezzar II wasn't just a king, he was a builder on an epic scale, a devout patron of the gods, and a formidable military leader. His reign represents the final dazzling flourish of native Mesopotamian power before the arrival of the Persians. He inherited an empire that stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the borders of Egypt, encompassing Syria, Judah, and much of the Levant. He secured these vast territories with decisive military campaigns, famously besieging and capturing Jerusalem and deporting many of its inhabitants to Babylon, an event etched into the memory of history, particularly in the Hebrew Bible. This act of conquest and deportation, a mainstream historical fact, solidified Babylonian control over the western provinces. But it was in Babylon itself where Nebuchadnezzar's true passion lay. He transformed the city into a wonder of the ancient world, fulfilling the prophecies of grandeur associated with its very name. Imagine approaching Babylon and seeing its colossal Ishtar Gate, built of brilliant blue glazed bricks, adorned with majestic lions, dragons, and bulls. This was not just an entrance, it was a vibrant, symbolic masterpiece, welcoming visitors into a city of unparalleled magnificence. You can almost feel the smooth, cool surface of those glazed bricks under your fingertips as you pass beneath the arch. Inside the walls, the city was a labyrinth of wonders. The main processional way, leading from the Ishtar Gate to the Esagila, the great temple of the god Marduk, was paved with red and white stone, lined with lion reliefs, making every step a ceremonial experience. At the heart of the city rose the Atemananki, the massive ziggurat dedicated to Marduk, often identified with the biblical Tower of Babel. Imagine its towering height, visible for miles, a symbol of human aspiration reaching for the heavens. While its exact dimensions are debated, it was undoubtedly an awe-inspiring structure, requiring immense resources and labor. This monumental building project is a quintessential representation of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And then there are the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Whether they truly existed as a terraced, irrigated marvel or were a later legendary creation, they capture the spirit of Nebuchadnezzar's ambition and the sophisticated engineering capabilities of the Neo-Babylonians. Imagine lush greenery cascading down artificial terraces, a verdant oasis in the dusty plain, watered by complex hydraulic systems. A quirky tidbit: the very existence of the Hanging Gardens is still debated by historians and archaeologists. Some suggest they were actually in the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, or simply a poetic invention. Regardless, the idea of them speaks volumes about the perceived luxury and ingenuity of Babylon. Beyond the grandeur, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was also a hub of intellectual activity. Astronomical observations, meticulously recorded for centuries, continued to flourish, leading to advanced understandings of celestial movements. Mathematics, particularly in the sexagesimal base 60 system, continued to develop, influencing later civilizations. Scribes diligently copied and preserved ancient texts, ensuring the continuity of Mesopotamian literary and scholarly traditions. This was a city not just of power, but of profound knowledge. Despite its outward splendor, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was relatively short-lived. Nebuchadnezzar II's successors were less capable, leading to political instability and internal strife. The vast wealth accumulated through trade and tribute, coupled with the immense expenditure on building projects, put a strain on the empire's resources. Historians still argue whether the empire's internal weaknesses were more significant in its downfall than the external threat that was rapidly gathering momentum. Both undoubtedly played a role. As you stand amidst the imagined glory of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, bathed in the glow of its glazed brick gates and towering ziggurat, you feel a sense of both awe and impending change. This magnificent city represents the culmination of millennia of Mesopotamian civilization, a final, brilliant testament to its ingenuity and enduring spirit. But just as all empires rise, so too must they face their ultimate test, and a new power, from a land beyond the Zagros, was already casting a very long shadow. The magnificent glow of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, for all its splendor, couldn't mask the inevitable tides of imperial change. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, though powerful, suffered from a succession of weaker rulers after its great builder, coupled with growing internal dissent. The stage was now set for the final, decisive act in Mesopotamia's story as an independent, dominant power, and the curtain would fall with the arrival of the Persian conquest under Cyrus the Great. Imagine a new sweeping wind blowing in from the east, an unstoppable force that would absorb Babylon without a single major battle. The new threat emerged from the highlands of ancient Iran, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Unlike the Assyrians, who were known for their brutality, or the Babylonians, who reveled in monumental displays, the Persians under Cyrus were masters of diplomacy and psychological warfare, often preferring peaceful submission to costly conquest. Cyrus, a truly remarkable figure, had already forged a vast empire, absorbing the Medes, the Lydians, and various Greek cities in Anatolia. His reputation for clemency towards conquered peoples often preceded him, making resistance seem futile and unnecessary. This strategic approach, a mainstream historical fact, contrasted sharply with the methods of earlier Mesopotamian empires. By 539 BCE, the time had come for Babylon. The city, still gleaming with Nebuchadnezzar's lavish constructions, was ruled by Nabonidus, a king who was unpopular with many of his own subjects, particularly the powerful Marduk priesthood. Nabonidus had alienated many by favoring the moon god Sin over Babylon's patron deity, Marduk, and by spending much of his time away from the capital. This internal division within Babylon was a fatal weakness, something Cyrus was acutely aware of and skillfully exploited. The Persian army, led by Gobryas, a general loyal to Cyrus, approached Babylon. Instead of a drawn-out siege, the story goes that the Persians cleverly diverted the Euphrates River, causing its water level to drop significantly. Under the cover of night, their soldiers simply marched along the dry riverbed, entering the city through its unguarded river gates. Imagine the sheer audacity and ingenuity of such a plan, bypassing the legendary walls that had protected Babylon for so long. A quirky tidbit recounted by the Greek historian Herodotus, though some details are debated, claims that the Babylonians were so confident in their defenses and so absorbed in a festival that they didn't even realize the city had been breached until the Persians were already inside. It's a bit like someone raiding your fridge while you're busy binging a show. The fall of Babylon was swift and remarkably bloodless. Nabonidus was captured, and Cyrus entered the city triumphantly. Far from destroying Babylon, Cyrus presented himself as a liberator, restoring order and respecting the local gods. He famously allowed deported peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. This policy of tolerance and religious freedom was a hallmark of Cyrus's rule and contributed to the stability of his vast empire. He even made offerings to Marduk, acknowledging the local deity and further cementing his image as a legitimate ruler rather than a foreign oppressor. With the Persian conquest, Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, lost its independent political identity for the first time in millennia. It became a satrapy, or province, within the much larger Achaemenid Empire. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing for the average person. Persian rule often brought stability, improved infrastructure, like the royal road, facilitating communication, and integrated Mesopotamia into a vast economic network stretching from India to Greece. Culturally, Mesopotamian traditions continued, but they were now part of a larger, composite imperial culture. Cuneiform continued to be used for administrative purposes, alongside Aramaic, which would become the lingua franca of the empire. Babylonian scribes and astronomers continued their work, contributing their knowledge to the Persian administration. Yet the distinct, sovereign Mesopotamian power was gone. Historians still argue whether the Persian conquest was a benevolent liberation or simply a more sophisticated form of subjugation, absorbing Mesopotamia into a foreign empire. It was likely both, depending on your perspective and status. As you reflect on this momentous shift, you realize that the story of Mesopotamia doesn't end here, but its narrative as the central self-determining actor does. The land between the rivers, which had nurtured the first cities, the first laws, and the first empires, was now a vital yet subordinate part of an even grander global design. Its legacy, however, was far from over, destined to echo through the ages and influence those who would come next. The grand tapestry of Mesopotamian history, while no longer woven by independent local rulers, continued to evolve under the vast umbrella of the Persian Empire. But even the mighty Achaemenids, like all their predecessors, eventually faced their own formidable challenge. You're now stepping into the era of Hellenistic echoes, a period beginning around 331 BCE, when a new cultural force, the Greeks, would sweep across the Near East, bringing with them a different vision of empire and a profound, lasting influence. Imagine the ancient world being shaken by a whirlwind, and when it settles, the familiar landscape is subtly, yet irrevocably, altered. The force that shattered the Persian Empire was none other than Alexander the Great of Macedon. His lightning-fast conquests, culminating in the decisive Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, brought Mesopotamia under Greek rule. Alexander famously entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a liberator from Persian rule, paying homage to Marduk and ordering the reconstruction of the Esagila temple. He even planned to make Babylon one of his imperial capitals, a testament to the city's enduring strategic and symbolic importance. You can almost picture him riding through the Ishtar Gate, a young conqueror awestruck by the ancient grandeur. This dramatic shift in power is a mainstream historical fact, marking the beginning of a new chapter for Mesopotamia. After Alexander's premature death, his vast empire was carved up among his generals, the Diadochi. Mesopotamia, along with much of the Near East, fell largely under the control of Seleucus Thamir Nicator, one of Alexander's most capable generals. This ushered in the Seleucid Empire, a Hellenistic kingdom that would rule Mesopotamia for over 2 centuries. The Seleucids, while heirs to Alexander's legacy, were Greeks, and they brought with them Greek language, Greek political structures, Greek art, and Greek customs. This period was characterized by a fascinating cultural fusion. While Greek remained the language of administration and the elite, Aramaic continued to be widely spoken by the general populace, and cuneiform, surprisingly, persisted, particularly in scholarly and religious contexts. Babylonian priests and astronomers continued their ancient traditions, influencing Greek scientific thought. Imagine a bustling street scene where you hear a mix of Greek and Aramaic being spoken, and perhaps catch a glimpse of a scribe still diligently working on a cuneiform tablet. The Seleucids founded many new cities throughout their empire, often named after themselves or Alexander. One of the most important was Seleucia on the Tigris, built not far from ancient Babylon. This city rapidly grew into a major urban center, eventually eclipsing Babylon as a commercial and administrative hub. While Babylon itself continued to exist, its monumental building projects ceased, and its population gradually dwindled, many moving to the newer Greek foundations. It's like a new, shinier mall opening up down the road, slowly drawing away all the customers from the old downtown. A quirky tidbit from this era is the latest known cuneiform tablet to have been dated, an astronomical almanac from 75 CE. This means that cuneiform, a script invented nearly 3 millennia earlier, was still being used by a handful of dedicated Babylonian astronomers and priests well into the Roman period. Imagine that. It's a testament to the incredible longevity of this writing system and the tenacity of Babylonian intellectual traditions, clinging on even as the world around them shifted dramatically. Historians still argue about the precise reasons for its final demise, whether it was the decline of traditional Babylonian culture, the complete dominance of Aramaic and Greek, or simply a lack of new scribes. The Seleucid kings also adopted some Mesopotamian traditions, acknowledging the local deities and even participating in Babylonian religious festivals, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to governance. However, the overall thrust of the empire was Hellenization, the spread of Greek culture. Greek theaters, gymnasiums, and philosophical schools were established. You might even see a Greek wrestling match taking place near an ancient ziggurat. The Seleucid Empire, like all before it, eventually faced challenges from within and without. The rising power of the Parthians, an Iranian people, gradually chipped away at their eastern territories, culminating in the Parthian conquest of Mesopotamia in the mid-2nd century BCE. But the Hellenistic period had left an indelible mark. Greek architectural styles, artistic motifs, and philosophical ideas continued to resonate in the region long after direct Greek rule ended. As you look upon this blending of ancient Mesopotamian resilience with vibrant Greek innovation, you realize that while the independent political story of Mesopotamia was largely over, its profound cultural and intellectual legacy continued to flow outwards, influencing empires and civilizations far beyond its ancient riverbanks. The whispers of its past achievements would echo through these new eras, laying the groundwork for how future generations would understand the very concept of civilization. The sun has now set on the independent political might of Mesopotamia, but the twilight glow of its remarkable achievements lingers, casting long shadows across the centuries. You've witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of cities, and the invention of writing itself. But the story doesn't truly end with the Persian or Hellenistic conquests. It transitions into the enduring, often unseen legacy of Mesopotamia on the modern world. Imagine the subtle, pervasive influence of an ancient river flowing quietly beneath the surface of everything that came after. Even as Mesopotamia became a province within larger empires, Parthian, Roman, Sasanian, and eventually Islamic, its profound innovations continued to shape human civilization. Take writing, for example. The cuneiform script, though eventually replaced by alphabetic systems, was the prototype. It proved that complex ideas could be recorded and transmitted across time and space. Every time you read a book, send a text message, or even jot down a grocery list, you are, in a very distant way, echoing the frustration of that ancient Uruk scribe trying to count barley. It was the original data storage system, a mainstream historical fact that underscores its fundamental importance. Consider the concept of the city itself. Uruk wasn't just a large collection of huts. It was a planned urban environment with monumental architecture, administrative centers, and a diverse population. The blueprint for urban living, for complex social organization within walls, was laid out there. From the sewage systems they pioneered to the concept of public spaces and specialized labor, the very idea of what a city is owes a debt to Mesopotamia. Even your bustling modern metropolis, with its skyscrapers and intricate infrastructure, whispers of those ancient mud brick foundations. And then there's law. Hammurabi's code, while not always applied equally, established the principle of codified law, where rules were written down, accessible, at least in theory, and applied to all subjects. This notion of a standardized legal system, a framework for justice and order, profoundly influenced later legal traditions, including those of the Greeks, Romans, and ultimately our own. The very idea of innocent until proven guilty, or a fixed penalty for a specific crime, has its distant echoes in those clay tablets. Historians still argue about the precise direct influence of specific Mesopotamian laws on later legal codes versus the parallel development of legal thought across cultures. The truth is likely a blend of both, a shared human need for order, finding similar solutions. Mathematics and astronomy, too, owe an incredible debt to the Mesopotamians. Their sexagesimal base 60 number system is still with us every single day. Think about it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't arbitrary numbers. They come directly from the meticulous calculations of Babylonian astronomers and mathematicians. A quirky tidbit: they were even using a form of trigonometry long before the Greeks and could predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy. So, next time you check your watch or use a compass, remember those ancient scribes peering at the stars and making their calculations. Their religious and mythological narratives also resonated deeply. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its themes of friendship, loss, and the search for immortality, influenced later stories and philosophical ideas. The flood narrative, as you remember from Gilgamesh, found its way into later traditions, including the biblical account. Even the idea of a powerful, often unpredictable pantheon of gods interacting with humanity, and the concept of ziggurats as cosmic mountains connecting heaven and earth, shaped the religious imagination of the ancient world. As you consider this vast legacy, you realize that Mesopotamia wasn't just a place on a map. It was a crucible of human ingenuity, a laboratory where the fundamental building blocks of civilization were first forged. It was a place of astonishing firsts: the first cities, the first writing, the first empires, the first law codes, and groundbreaking advancements in science and engineering. So, as your journey through this ancient land comes to a close, and the whispers of its past achievements fade into the gentle rhythm of your breathing, know that the legacy of Mesopotamia isn't just confined to dusty museum exhibits or academic texts. It lives on, subtly yet profoundly, in the very fabric of your modern world. It's in the streets you walk, the laws you live by, the way you measure time, and the stories you tell. The grand narrative of ancient Mesopotamia now gently recedes, like the soft ebb of the Euphrates after a long day. The echoes of Sumerian chants, Akkadian boasts, and Babylonian wisdom quieten, fading into the peaceful hum of your own room. The dust of countless millennia settles, leaving behind not just ruins, but the deep foundational blueprints of human existence. Feel the quiet warmth of that journey, from the very first tentative steps of nomadic gatherers, seeking sustenance between two great rivers, to the awe-inspiring monuments of Uruk, reaching for the heavens. You've walked alongside kings, listened to the scribes, and witnessed the relentless march of empires, each leaving its indelible mark. The struggles for water, the birth of the written word, the crafting of laws. These weren't just events, they were the very slow, deliberate building blocks of the world you inhabit now. Let the images soften. The towering ziggurats, once symbols of immense power, now gently blur into the night sky. The clamor of ancient markets, the clang of bronze and iron, the murmur of forgotten languages, all transform into a comforting silence. The stories of Gilgamesh and Hammurabi, Sargon and Nebuchadnezzar become distant lullabies, their trials and triumphs now part of the deep, collective human dream. There's a profound continuity, you see, a quiet current connecting your cozy space to those ancient plains. The innovations, the ideas, the very patterns of human organization that began there ripple forward through time, touching everything. So rest now with the gentle knowledge that a piece of that extraordinary past still resonates within you, a soft, enduring whisper of civilization's dawn.